For those who come here seeking God, may God go with you. For those who come embracing life, may life return your affections. And for those who come to seek a path, may a way be found, and the courage to take it step by step. So as we explore our theme this month of invitation, the reading I want to provide to you today is perhaps the ultimate poem of invitation, one that's probably familiar to many of you. It's entitled The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me, your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I don't blame the Hungarian people. I'm sure there are good-hearted, well-meaning Hungarians, just as there are good-hearted, well-meaning people everywhere. But can we talk about what's going on in Hungary today, right now? Desperate families are being doused with water cannons. Women and children are being tear-gassed. Frantic, anxious, despairing people are being stabbed with barbed wire and razor ribbon as they flee their homeland, where for years they have faced imminent danger of death at the hands of their own government or the Islamic radical ISIS. Because word is getting out that Hungary is now hostile to them, the long line of refugees is diverting to Croatia. The only problem is that the Croat border is still full of landmines left over from the war with Serbia more than 20 years ago. But still, the people come. For a while, Hungary was willing to serve as a pipeline for the refugees trying to make their way to Germany. But then the government cracked down. They used prison labor to build a fence. Then they started arresting refugees. Now they're detaining entire extended families in detention camps, criminalizing their flight, and threatening to send them to jail for up to 5 years. And while all this is going on, the leaders of European Union nations are squabbling over the limits they'll place on settling refugees. 500,000, 100,000, 10,000. 10,000 a year, that's what the United States government is willing to do. Just a drop in the bucket. Now, we can point our fingers horrified at the Hungarian government, but let's not forget how our own nation reacted just a little more than a year ago. A little more than a year ago, when a flood of unaccompanied minors started crossing our southern border. Last year, our government detained an estimated 68,000 children. 68,000 children who crossed our border, many of whom were orphaned, having lost parents and grandparents to violence in their Central American homelands. By all accounts, we have remedied this crisis since there's been a 51% drop in children crossing our borders unaccompanied. But the truth is that in a diplomatic deal, we simply shifted the enforcement burden to Mexico, where at a still alarming rate, children are being detained and put into camps on that side of the border. And of course, we've got a chorus of presidential candidates promising to build a bigger, longer, better, higher fence along the border. So let's be careful about condemning or being horrified by Hungary's behavior. lest we think that issues around refugee resettlement and immigration are out there somewhere, that we here in Pennsylvania don't have to think about this in our own lives, I'll tell you that our Commonwealth is home to nearly 800,000 people who were born outside the United States, and about a quarter of those are undocumented. And because our economy is strong, Pennsylvania attracts thousands of new residents each year coming from other countries. In the greater Philadelphia area, immigrants account for about 10% of the economic impact of the region, and undocumented immigrants pay more than $150 million a year in taxes into the state coffers. How we receive and treat those born outside the United States is a very real issue right here in our own home state. The question that the crisis in Europe and along our own southern border raises for me is, what are we so afraid of? What are we so afraid of? I wonder why we aren't extending an open invitation to those fleeing violence and seeking asylum. If you are to believe certain fearmongers who shall not be named, it's all about the criminal element crossing our borders who are coming to rape and rob us. Others claim that refugees are going to take all our jobs, while still others say, no, they're just going to be freeloaders who overtax and overburden our public assistance programs. It all comes down to fear, it seems. To me, what's happening in Hungary and in Arizona and Texas is as much a spiritual crisis as it is a humanitarian one. It speaks to who we are and how we see ourselves. And I wonder how much of what's happening globally or nationally is a reflection of our own personal challenges with welcoming the stranger, of how hard it is for us individually to extend an open invitation to let others into our lives. I was amused last Sunday when I heard that one of our members asked the question, so when is it Invite a Friend Sunday this year? My answer, of course, is every Sunday is Invite a Friend Sunday. But this person apparently needed the structure and support of a program to feel free to invite a friend to experience our community. If we're reluctant to invite a friend to visit our own church, how hard then is it to think about welcoming someone who looks or speaks or believes differently from us into our communities, into our neighborhoods, or thousands of them into our country? Fear of difference, fear of the stranger, fear of the other seems to be a deeply embedded human instinct. Countless psychological studies have shown that we tend to naturally group people into categories based on traits that are either similar to our own or different from us. Psychologists have developed something called the implicit association test, which has proven that we unconsciously associate positive words with groups that we consider ourselves to be a part of, and we ascribe negative traits to those who are not part of our own groups. Psychologists have even determined that we are biased against groups we know nothing about. In one experiment, scientists compared attitudes towards two sets of made-up names. One set was supposedly American, and the other was from a fictitious country called Marasat, someplace that doesn't even exist. And even though the subjects knew nothing about Marasat, they showed a consistent bias against it. The Southern Poverty Law Center runs a web version of the IAT that measures biases based on race and age and gender. And this survey has found that respondents are far more likely to associate European faces, Caucasian faces, rather than Asian faces with so-called American images. The implication is that Asians are seen as less American than Caucasians. Now, if we stopped here, we might conclude that it's all really hopeless, that all human beings are biased just to differing degrees, and that difference is threatening to us no matter our social group or situation. But there is a ray of hope, at least on the psychological side. One study has shown that when test subjects are informed of the results of their test, revealing their biases and prejudice, those who were concerned about the results actually improved with subsequent testing. So if you're biased, and as we know from Avenue Q, we're all a little bit racist, right? And you want to change, if you want to change, you can. Guilt and shame, it seems, can be powerful motivators. Unfortunately, though, they're only motivators for those who feel guilt or shame, those who want to do better. Now, I said a few moments ago that our response to the flood of refugees pouring out of Syria or the children coming across our border with Mexico is evidence of a spiritual crisis. I don't think it's just about psychology and our inborn fear of the other or the stranger. It goes deeper than that. How we respond to the other, whether it's a flood of refugees or a new neighbor down the street, speaks to our view of the world and our own place in it. And that's really a spiritual matter. It goes to how we want to live our lives and the choices that we make every day. Now, some of you know me well enough to know that I'm not a fan of dichotomies, of the either-or. I try to seek out the both-and perspective in most situations. But this spiritual crisis that we're witnessing right now in Hungary and in the presidential debates, they seem to create some pretty bright line distinctions. So here are some of the spiritual choices that I think we're compelled to make when we encounter someone crossing a border into what we consider to be our territory. First, and perhaps foremost, is the question of scarcity versus abundance. If we believe that there is a limited amount of stuff to go around, whether that stuff is job opportunities or food or freedom, then we're bound to guard our piece of the pie rather aggressively. If we see our lives as a zero-sum game, where anything I gain comes as a loss to you, you're going to try pretty hard to end up on the winning side, right? If, however, we view our lives as expansive and abundant, if we trust in the generosity of others and the universe, if we trust in the goodness of others and perhaps trust in the goodness of God, we'll ease our death grip on our stuff and share it freely. When we choose to believe, and this is a spiritual choice, that a rising tide lifts all boats, when we choose to believe that a rising tide truly will lift all boats, we'll actually want to open the floodgates and let the water flow in. Time and time again, we've seen that those who have been the recipients of generosity are the most generous among us, and perhaps we can learn something from them. To trust in the abundance of the universe and to believe that there is enough, even more than enough, to go around. So when we think of opening the borders of our countries or of our hearts, the first question we must ask ourselves is whether we stand in a place of scarcity or abundance. The second spiritual dichotomy that we are forced to face in the current environment is similar to the first. And it asks, are we inherently open and accepting, or do we default to doubt and distrust? Our Unitarian Universalist principles teach us to trust the inherent worthiness of every person. And sometimes we have personal experiences that make that very challenging. Some evidence really does point to a contrary conclusion. Living into our first principle, as Chrissy pointed out, is challenging, for sure. But when we think about welcoming the other, about extending a true invitation to someone with whom we don't identify, we can choose to believe in that person's inherent goodness, or we can simply keep the door bolted shut and don't let them in. Now, granted, sometimes we might get hurt if we let another one in. But consider what we might miss out on if we never open the door. The rich tapestry of life will simply be unavailable to us. And so I ask, which will we choose? To approach the world with expectancy and hope, or to cower in fear of what welcoming the other might do to all that is familiar and comfortable to us? This humanitarian catastrophe, as well as the stranger in our own midst, also calls us to question whether we see ourselves as separate and independent beings, or whether we're truly part of a larger whole, something that is greater than just ourselves. Our faith tells us that we are all part of the interdependent web of all existence. We are all connected, each to the other. What affects us all. Or as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, all of us on this planet are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. The African people have a principle called Ubuntu, from South Africa. Ubuntu says, I don't exist without you. I am because you are. And so as we watch the pictures of despairing families marching hundreds and hundreds of miles with nothing more than the shirts on their backs, as we see those images of men in inner tubes clinging to small rafts as they cross treacherous waters, as we watch mothers handing over their children to people they don't know, human smugglers with desperation wrought on their faces, who do we see? Who do we see? Do we see the other, or do we see ourselves? If we look closely and we believe in our interdependence, what we find is not our differences, not that these people are other, but we see ourselves. We see our common humanity. We come to know that under the same circumstances, we too would do whatever we could to save our children and our mothers and our fathers and our families. These are not strangers. Strangers who might, if they make it, come to threaten our way of life. They are us. They are us. In religious terms, we realize not just our common humanity, but also our common divinity. We are all children of God, and when we join together, we make up God. And so, our hearts must open up to these people, and we must invite them in with open arms. Whenever we encounter someone who looks or thinks or believes or acts differently from ourselves, whether it's a family fleeing violence in a foreign land or simply an individual who walks through those doors on a Sunday morning and comes to our church, these are the questions that must guide our response to them. May we choose wisely and well. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.